And with that development, how do you see human nature? Do you see human nature as muddied, trying to become pure, or beginning at pure and then getting muddied and then trying to go back to pure? Like, how do you see that?
Well, we do happen to have a chapter on human nature in
Yeah.
this book, and pondering that same question that you just raised, I more or less come to the conclusion it's not that there's a definable human nature, it's not that you can say, because I mean, look, Buddha was a human being, Hitler was a human being. One is full of compassion and love and giving, the other is full of greed and aggression and hatred. They're both human beings, so how can you talk about a defined human nature? However, what I think we can say confidently, that there's a certain human potential based on human needs. If those needs are met, development will be healthy and those potentials will be realized. If those needs are frustrated, which they severely were in the case of, say, a Hitler, a terribly abused child, then what you get is the hatred and the rage and the murderous venom that characterize that personality. Now, when you couple that with political power, you see what happens. But that's not human nature. It's just human nature thwarted because the needs of that child were not met in a society that was completely incapable of meeting people's needs. In fact, totally abused them. So human nature to me is not a given. What we have is a human potential based on human needs. So if these needs are satisfied, we can be reasonably confident that people will be connected and generous. Most people want to be kind. I mean, it's interesting in this society, when somebody does something selfish or greedy, we say that's just human nature.
Mm.
Do we say that when somebody's kind or generous?
Yeah, never.
The educator Alfie Kohn points that out. And if you ask most people, when does your body feel more at ease? When do you experience more peace? When you're being kind and generous and giving, authentically, not out of a sense of duty, but because that was just the impulse. Or when you're grasping and greedy, when is there more tension and more discomfort inside? So that should tell us something about our nature, that our nature wants to be aligned with connection and generosity and giving. Because our bodies will tell us that.
That is so true. That is so true. I mean, there is no time in life when you're bitter at someone or angry at someone that makes you feel good inside. Like it does, yeah, gut-wise too. I'm not just meaning in the heart space, but in all areas of your body, the tension, the stress, the holding, the tightening. But like we were talking about earlier, society's set up in a way for false identification and divisive identification, whether it be two sets of soccer fans who now hate each other or rioting, or whether it be, you know, political parties, or whether it be businesses at war with each other, right? Like everything's set up in a way to get you to identify with something in order for you to be against something. Like that's what naturally ends up happening. Even schools, like I went to this school, you went to that school, we competed. Competition seems to be something that has been carefully crafted by capitalist society. And then when you see the rise of, and by the way, I love competition. So a healthy competition is great. So I'm not talking bad about competition, but it's interesting to see how, again, it's so hard to compete without identifying as that being your worth.
Yeah.
And that requires so much mental, spiritual strength, in my opinion, to be able to differentiate between identification and attachment.
Well, it's really interesting because let's take the example of sports that you just mentioned. What do we call the people who participate in the sports? Do we call them players? What do we call the process that they're engaged in? We call it a game. But we don't treat it like players. We don't treat it like a game. Because real games and real play has no agenda. There's competition in the process and you want to do your best. But in the end, it doesn't matter. It was just, it's for the process and for the joy of it. That's genuine play. Well, when you think about these multi-billion-dollar sports industries and the strategy and the hype that goes into, these are not players anymore. These are warriors, almost as if they're engaged in some kind of a battle. And winning and losing becomes everything. Like the famous Vince Lombardi, winning is not the only thing, it's the only thing. Well, that's not true, people. That's true for the purposes of playing, as long as you recognize that you're only playing, as long as you don't confuse the game with life itself. But once it becomes a business and becomes cutthroat, that confusion is really prevalent. And people take it so seriously. So when you think about it, like you have these terrible conflicts in the world, like the war in the Ukraine right now. The average person, how much time are they induced to spend thinking about those large issues? Or say about climate change, that only the blindest of the blind or the wickedest of the wickedest can at this point deny as a reality. But how much of our life do we spend actually pondering and engaging with these larger issues compared with analyzing which quarterback should have played in which quarter of which particular NFL game, so that these so-called games and these so-called players have assumed a far larger importance in our lives, whereas the real things we tend to ignore.
You've just sparked something for me that I was blown away by this experience. I recently went to Rwanda, and I went there with Ellen DeGeneres in collaboration with the Dian Fossey Fund has opened up a gorilla sanctuary and a conservation center.
Yes.
And we went there to trek with the gorillas, learn about Rwanda. And I had never been to Rwanda before. I didn't know if I would have visited if it wasn't for her. And the biggest thing I took away, obviously trekking with gorillas and being in nature with a form of life that has no interest in us, but we're totally fascinated by them, was an incredible experience. And I'll talk about that separately. But the reason I brought it up here is I also took time to go to the Genocide Memorial Museum.
Yes.
And it was fascinating for me to learn that it's been around 20 years. From what I remember, 1/10 of the population of the country, so like 1 million people, out of like 10 million people, died in the genocide, were killed in the genocide.
Yeah.
And most of the people who live there today, it was their parents, it was their ancestors that did this just 20 years ago, which is not a long time at all. And I met some of the survivors. I sat with them in the museum. I talked to them. We talked to the locals. We talked to people that were helping us with our travel and arrangements and the hotels we stayed at. And it fascinated me that the people were so healed.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was such a genuine, sincere conversation that they've now let go of this two-tribe culture. They've let go of the names, the identification, that they're living by a principle they call Ubuntu. I am because you are, I believe, or you are because I am. Like that's, I'll get that right. But Ubuntu is the word that they use. And it was so special. I was totally...
I'm curious to ask, did you delve into what allowed them to do that?
They said a lot of it came through the leadership. Like they said that was how they were being it's what you're saying. Like when you said like they were asked to, you're saying we don't make time to focus on these huge issues because we're too busy wondering which player played in which position.
Yeah.
They didn't say it in that way, but that's what they were saying, that our leadership encouraged us to think in this way. And I couldn't believe that in 20 years when your parents have probably killed their parents, that you were standing next to each other, not worrying about the lineage that this culture was set up. And it was the Europeans who set up part of that anyway.